With the crash in the price of crude oil owing to virtual shutdown of global economy ravaged by COVID-19 by the second quarter of 2020, Nigeria's foreign exchange inflows almost dried up, again unsurprisingly due to the economic shutdown and collapse of supply chains. Nigeria and most countries of the world went into deep recession by the third quarter of 2020. Now, the outcome of the pandemic has no doubt affected the foreign exchange flows into the country, as the aggregate foreign exchange inflows into the country in the fourth quarter rose to $23.60 billion from $21.46 billion in the third quarter, leading to an increase of 10% over the previous quarter, but a decline of 35% below the level in the corresponding quarter, which was $36.32 billion. According to the Central Bank of Nigeria in the latest report, foreign exchange flows through the economy for the fourth quarter disclosed that though there was an increase in foreign exchange flows through the economy in the review quarter compared with the preceding quarter due to the reopening of most economies, including Nigeria. But the second wave of COVID-19 has hampered a return to the levels experienced in the corresponding quarter of 2019. Well, I have joining me live from our Abuja studios to give insight into the first topic of our conversation today is the professor of capital markets and the president of Capital Markets Academics of Nigeria, Professor Uche Uwaleke. Thank you very much, Professor Uwaleke, for your time. It's great to see you.
Thank you very much, Tolu. My pleasure being here.
Prof, I saw this report yesterday and I say foreign exchange inflows into the country is rising due to the reopening of economies. Now, let's look at what impact do you think this will really have, well, maybe first on our country's reserves?
Well, of course, the reopening of economies, global economies will impact positively on foreign reserves, on external reserves. And that's because we expect that capital importation will also improve. Now, if you look at the capital importation reports by the National Bureau of Statistics, now it is very clear that COVID-19 pandemic affected the inflows negatively in 2020. In 2020, for example, total capital importation was just in the region of $9 billion. First quarter through the fourth quarter. As a matter of fact, in the fourth quarter, it was just $1 billion. Now, compare this to $23 billion in 2019. So, it's very clear that COVID-19 really had a negative impact on capital inflows, into the country, and that also reflected in external reserves. Because one of the sources of inflows into the external reserve is foreign investments. So the fact that the COVID-19 had negative impact on world economies in 2020. Reflected in our external reserves, negatively. There's no doubt about that. And with the vaccine promise, with the vaccine rollout promise, there's every indication that this will, this will improve. If you look at diaspora remittances as well, diaspora remittances suffered in 2020, again on account of COVID. The average we understand in 2020 was around $20 billion. Again, compare this to about $23 billion in the previous year. Yes. So we expect that going forward, with economies now being reopened, especially given the fact that the bulk of inflows into this country, come from the UK and the USA. So with these economies being reopened, we expect that inflows into the nation's stock of foreign currencies will of course improve.
Something worries me here, Prof. As the figures of foreign reserves is now out, it shows that it's declining since the month of February. I'm not looking at the correlation as to how inflows are rising and reserves are declining. What could be responsible for all of this?
Yes, yes, it's easy to see why it's declining. Even if you look at the oil sources, for example, look at what happened in 2020. Now, in spite of the fact that towards the end of 2020, the fourth quarter of 2020, for example, oil price really appreciated. Okay, the revenue from oil equally dropped, and that's on account of the fact that output dropped. Don't forget, the oil revenue is a function of not just oil price but output. Again, according to the MBS, crude oil output declined from about 2 million barrels per day in the first quarter of 2020 to just about 1.57 million barrels per day in the fourth quarter of 2020. Okay, this is contained in the GDP report that we saw for Q4 of 2020. So as long as we don't also match appreciation in crude oil price with crude oil output, we shall continue to experience drop even from crude oil sales. Okay, yes, but I think another source of worry why we are also experiencing decline in external reserves, in spite of the appreciation in crude oil price, also happens to be the fact that the other sources that I mentioned earlier, are also drying up. Talking about foreign inflows, capital importation. Now, if you look at the capital importation for 2020, for example, what used to be the major source, which is foreign portfolio investment, now took the rear. Okay, so the bulk of what we had came from other investments. Foreign direct investments, foreign portfolio investments, were quite abysmal in performance. So it was just other investments which, were predominantly loans. Of course, we took loans in 2020, and that reflected in, capital importation. So even when you have accretion to external reserves, that accretion will be affected when you also have pressure on the reserves themselves, by way of demand. So again, the reopening of the economies, especially in the case of Nigeria, has also induced a lot of demand for forex, such that as we speak, there is still pressure in the forex market. And if you also look at the Nigerian Stock Exchange domestic and foreign portfolio investment report, it also confirms it that foreign investors are still exiting the country. And when they exit, of course, they want to convert, they want to take forex to leave. So the central bank is still being challenged by arrears of unmet forex demand, okay, including genuine demands for imports and demands by foreign investors who wish to exist. So it is the demand for forex that is also responsible for the fate of what we're experiencing in the external reserves, which, of course, is also showing up in the exchange rate, which is why exchange rate has also continued to be high. So demand is one factor, supply is also another factor, which explains why the central bank now has decided to also look at the supply side, having over the years tried to manage the demand side, including through the introduction of restriction of access with respect to 42 items. The central bank is now turning its attention to the supply side, recognizing that it has little or nothing to do with the crude oil price. So part of that supply side measures, of course, include what we have seen recently, some measures we've seen recently. The first is that people can now withdraw money sent to them in the same foreign currencies, in which they were sent. And we understand that has started yielding some positive results. We hear that weekly, for example, remittances increased from $5 million to about $30 million.
Yes, Prof.
And the latest, which is the naira for dollar.
Exactly.
Naira for dollar.
Prof, allow me to interject, because that's my next question. Are you already going there? But let me just be clear. Let's clear this angle. Now, diaspora remittances, you also alluded to that. I've seen an impact. Is also doing very good, positively. Now, what would you say about the naira for dollar policy that was introduced by the CBN? Are you saying that that was a step in the right direction? And in its totality, what's your assessment of our forex segment? Even the WTO was talking about our forex management system. That's the DG that has been in town. What do you make of all of this?
Yes, the WTO DG's advice is consistent with what IMF has also recommended, which is having a permanent solution to especially the premium, if you like, between the official and the
Parallel market.
Parallel market rate. And that solution will be to unify exchange rates. Okay, by the time you unify exchange rates, you create an incentive for exports in the first instance, and you also create an incentive for foreign inflows, foreign investments, because you remove uncertainties around exchange rate management, and you create some confidence. Recall that the DG WTO was saying that some countries are already complaining about the multiple exchange rates that the country is operating. Of course, that has its negative consequences, round tripping, and all that. So there is no doubt at all that unifying exchange rates will, as I said earlier, incentivize exports and also encourage exporters to repatriate export proceeds. And we also know that will show up positively on our balance of payments. Okay. There's no doubt about that. But the real challenge is the pain, associated pain that will come from its immediate implementation. Because for example, as we speak, this country imports a lot of petroleum products. And if exchange rate is unified now and adjusted to maybe a price above 400 naira to the dollar, you can imagine the impact it will have on the pump price of fuel, because the pump price of fuel we are having now is not just as a result of the increase in the international crude oil price, but also a function of exchange rate. So it's going to cause a lot of distortion in the economy in the short term, no doubt, and that's why the IMF even recommended adopting a multi-step approach, while trying to unify exchange rates. Now, the other issue is the naira for dollar, which I mentioned, has to do with an attempt to also stimulate supply, because that is the major challenge we are having today. Okay, if we can have enough supply, to match demand, of course, you would expect that even if you allow market forces to determine price, establish equilibrium price, that equilibrium price will be lower than where it is today. So supply is critical. So in an attempt to do that, the central bank is having this incentive, which we understand has worked in some countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh. So what it does is to incentivize those who are remitting this money into Nigeria by giving them some form of rebate and making it cheaper for them to do so, and encouraging them to remit these funds through recognized formal channels, talking about international money transfer operators. So the central bank expects that within the 2-month window, the 60 days window, we should be able to see an improvement in diaspora remittances, which will of course reduce the pressure in the forex market. So as I said, we had experimental period, after which the central bank will decide whether or not to continue with it. But I think if we go by what has happened in Pakistan and Bangladesh, we should expect that the forex pressure will come down. As a result of this policy, a number of Nigerians in diaspora will be encouraged, to remit funds, to Nigeria.
Prof.
And I also talked about the demand.
Okay.
Demand. You see, and I get worried when certain measures or policies, also tend to put more pressure on this demand. I'm now referring to the recent approval by the Federal Executive Council, to spend $1.5 billion rehabilitating the Port Harcourt refinery. In my view, I think it's something we should take a second look at. I don't know what you think, Tolu, but my take is that if you have a project, or you have an asset that has taken you over $25 billion, according to some estimates, just to rehabilitate, to turn around over a period of 25 years, and yet nothing has come out of it, and yet these assets have refused to be fruitful, to be productive. Okay, I don't think the government should continue to waste money in the name of rehabilitating or turning around, such assets. I think the idea of selling the assets as they are to whoever is interested in buying, makes more sense. Because in finance, there's what we call the abandonment analysis approach, where you look at the present value of future streams of incomes from an asset, and you compare that with the cost of that asset and the cost of maintaining that asset over a long period of time, considering that the asset is an old asset, like the Port Harcourt refinery that is over 38 years. Okay, by the time you do that, you realize that it is in the interest of the country not to continue to rehabilitate. Okay, rather we should be thinking of even using that money to build new refineries. Because that's what to me makes sense. So it's important we look at the demand side, while we're also paying attention to the supply.
Yes, it's always good.
And part of that supply approach should of course be to boost exports. You have multiple streams of income through boosting your export base.
It's a good way to leave it there. I've been speaking, of course, a professor of capital markets and president of the Capital Markets Academics of Nigeria, Professor Uche Uwaleke. It's always a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much for your analysis. It's really appreciated.
Thank you, Tolu. Thank you.